It was the evening of July 17, 1996, a warm summer night at New York's JFK International Airport. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Runway lights flickered to life one by one, and the air buzzed with the familiar rhythm of takeoffs and landings. Ground crews moved briskly in their reflective vests, guiding planes and checking systems. Another busy night at one of America's largest airports. At Gate 27, a majestic Boeing 747-100 stood waiting. Trans World Airlines Flight 800, bound for Paris, France. Inside the terminal, passengers were finishing last-minute calls and hugs. Excited chatter filled the air. For many, this was a dream trip. Students heading home after summer programs, couples celebrating anniversaries, and families about to begin their European vacation. At 7 p.m., boarding began. Flight attendants welcomed passengers with warm smiles. Good evening. Welcome aboard TWA Flight 800 to Paris. The cabin filled slowly. Luggage thumped into overhead bins, seatbelts clicked, and children pressed their faces against the windows. In seat 19A, a middle-aged couple held hands. It was their 25th wedding anniversary. In row 23, a group of French students laughed, taking selfies before turning their phones off. A little girl pointed out of the window and whispered, "Look, Mama, the big planes." Up front in the cockpit, the crew worked through their pre-flight checklist. Captain Ralph Kevorkian, a veteran pilot with over 18,000 flight hours, sat confidently in command. Beside him was First Officer Stephen Snyder, equally experienced, and behind them, Flight Engineer Oliver Crick. Monitoring gauges and fuel levels. "Pre-flight complete," Crick said calmly. Captain Kevorkian nodded. Everything was standard. No alerts, no weather warnings. He radioed the control tower. TWA 800 ready for departure. Runway 22 right. The response came crisp and clear. TWA 800 cleared for takeoff. Climb and maintain 13,000 feet. Roger that, the captain replied, easing the throttles forward. The four engines roared to life. A deep, powerful sound that shook the air. The aircraft began its roll down the runway, gaining speed, its nose lifting gently as Captain Kevorkian called out, "V1, rotate." The Boeing 747 lifted off the ground, climbing steadily into the fading light. Inside the cabin, passengers looked out as New York's skyline drifted away beneath them. The Statue of Liberty, the Hudson River, and the city's glittering lights shrinking into the distance. A small girl smiled as the clouds swallowed the last view of the city. Her mother wrapped an arm around her. None of them knew that in just 12 minutes, everything would change. In the cockpit, the crew set the autopilot and relaxed slightly. "Another routine Atlantic crossing," the captain said. "Cabin pressure stable," replied the engineer. "Fuel readings normal. Center tank temperature, 59 degrees. The cockpit fell into quiet professionalism. Calm voices, the gentle hum of instruments, and the low vibration of jet engines. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared for the dinner service. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our in-flight service shortly. Please remain seated while the seatbelt sign is on." Some passengers took out novels. Others unfolded newspapers. A businessman sipped water and glanced at his watch. A newlywed couple smiled at each other, already dreaming about Paris. An elderly man by the window murmured softly, "I never get tired of this view." The plane climbed higher, reaching 13,000 feet over Long Island's South Shore. Radar screens in the control tower showed a calm green blip moving smoothly along its path. Nothing out of the ordinary. But beneath the calm surface, inside the massive aircraft, something unseen had begun. A tiny electrical wire, no thicker than a pencil lead, had started to overheat. It ran near the center fuel tank, where fuel vapors lingered in the heat of summer. No one could see it. No system could detect it, just a faint buildup of static, an invisible danger. On the ground below, some fishermen off the coast of Long Island were wrapping up their day. As they packed their nets, they noticed a faint streak of light in the distant sky. "Probably a flare," one of them said casually. They didn't know they were witnessing the first signs of one of America's most haunting aviation disasters. Back in the cockpit,
The crew prepared for the next altitude climb. "Fuel transfer complete?"
"Affirmative," replied Crick. Captain Kevorkian leaned back slightly, calm and confident. He had done this flight hundreds of times. Everything was normal. The steady thrum of engines, the hum of air through the cabin, the peaceful silence of a night sky. The passengers were relaxed. Dinner trays clinked softly. Someone laughed quietly. Someone prayed. Someone closed their eyes. It was 6:42 p.m. In one more minute, a single spark, so small it would never be seen, would ignite vapors inside the fuel tank. And at 6:43 p.m., the sky above the Atlantic would flash brighter than the sunset, a blinding explosion that would end 230 lives in an instant, and mark one of the darkest nights in American aviation history. 6:42 p.m. On the radar screen at New York Air Traffic Control, TWA Flight 800 appeared as a calm, steady green blip, cruising normally at 13,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. In the control room, the air was quiet. Controllers spoke in calm tones, monitoring dozens of flights across the eastern seaboard. Nothing seemed out of place. TWA 800 was just another evening departure, a routine climb before its long Atlantic crossing. But in the sky above Long Island, within the belly of the giant Boeing 747, something invisible was happening. Something that no one could have predicted, and no one could stop. Inside the center fuel tank, the mixture of air and fuel vapor had reached a dangerous level. A single spark, most likely from a worn wire or short circuit, jumped where it shouldn't have. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. And then, a blinding orange-white flash tore through the tank. The explosion ripped the heart out of the aircraft. From the beaches of Long Island to fishing boats out at sea, people looked up in confusion. Witnesses later described what they saw. Some said it looked like a streak of light rising up toward the plane. Others saw a sudden ball of fire, a massive bloom of orange and red that lit up the evening sky. One fisherman, Mike Wire, later told investigators, "I thought it was fireworks. Then I realized it was a plane." At that moment, Flight 800 was torn apart in mid-air. The initial blast blew off the nose section, including the cockpit, killing the pilots instantly. The rest of the aircraft, now a burning shell, broke into two large sections, the forward fuselage and the aft tail assembly. Fire erupted through the cabin. Seats, walls, and panels shredded in seconds. The cabin lights flickered, then vanished. The roar of engines turned into a deafening scream as flames tore through the wings. The plane, which had moments earlier been gliding smoothly through the golden light of dusk, was now a fireball over the Atlantic. Inside, chaos lasted only a few seconds. Passengers didn't have time to scream or react. The decompression was instant. Air rushed out, tearing through the fuselage like a storm. Luggage and debris were sucked into the sky. Some fragments, cabin walls, seat cushions, oxygen masks, began their long fall toward the dark ocean below. Within moments, the cockpit and nose separated completely, falling away in silence. The main fuselage, still carrying hundreds of burning gallons of fuel, continued forward for several seconds, engulfed in fire. Then gravity took over. The massive plane, what was left of it, began its final descent. From the ground, witnesses saw two distinct fireballs, one smaller, one larger, streaking down toward the sea. The sky, moments ago peaceful and clear, now burned like a wound. In the New York Air Traffic Control Center, a controller's voice broke the silence. TWA 800. Climb and maintain 15,000. No response. TWA 800, do you read? Still nothing. Another controller tried again. TWA 800. Radar contact lost. The green dot, that small, glowing sign of life, had vanished from the radar screen. At first, they assumed radio interference. Maybe a temporary signal dropout. But within seconds, reports began flooding in from the coast. Explosion in the sky. We saw a plane go down. Something's burning over the ocean. The controllers looked at each other, realization dawning. Something terrible had just happened. Out at sea, fishermen turned their boats toward the glow. The surface of the Atlantic was dotted with burning debris. small fires dancing on the water, pieces of metal and fabric floating among waves. A few saw what looked like human figures in life vests. But by the time rescuers arrived, the sea had already claimed them. The U.S. Coast Guard, Navy and local rescue teams scrambled within minutes. Helicopters lifted off, their searchlights cutting through the darkening sky. But there were no flares, no life rafts, no signals, just flaming wreckage and silence. One Coast Guard pilot radioed back in a shaken voice. "There's nothing left. Just debris. The whole thing's gone, on shore." News began to spread quickly. Phones rang in newsrooms across New York, eyewitnesses describing a giant fireball falling into the sea. Within half an hour, TV networks broke the news. Breaking: TWA Flight 800 has disappeared off radar near Long Island. Families waiting at JFK's Terminal 5 froze. At first, they clung to hope, maybe a communication issue, maybe an emergency landing. But when the first images appeared, burning wreckage on the ocean, rescue boats circling, hope turned to horror. For the next few hours, the Atlantic Ocean was a haunting scene. Searchlights swept across waves, illuminating twisted metal, seat cushions, and suitcases bobbing on the surface. Rescue boats moved slowly through the debris field, retrieving what they could. But the truth was devastatingly clear. There were no survivors. All 230 souls aboard TWA Flight 800 were gone. And yet, as the night deepened and the fires on the water faded, questions began to rise. What had caused the explosion? Was it a bomb? A missile? Sabotage? No one could understand how a massive Boeing 747 could just explode mid-air, without a single distress call, without warning, without time to react. All that remained was a silent ocean, a burning horizon, and a mystery that would haunt America for years to come. The night sky over Long Island was no longer peaceful. By 9 p.m., the horizon was glowing faintly orange from the fires still burning on the ocean's surface. The sound of rotor blades echoed through the humid air as U.S. Coast Guard and Navy helicopters swept low over the Atlantic, their powerful searchlights cutting across the dark waves. Below them, the sea was littered with fragments of what had once been TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747 that had vanished from radar less than 3 hours earlier. Now, the ocean was a graveyard. Floating on the water were seat cushions, life vests, twisted metal, and pieces of luggage. The Atlantic currents carried fragments for miles, spreading them into a wide field of destruction. Helicopter crews scanned desperately for any sign of survivors, but there were none. One pilot, circling at low altitude, whispered into his radio, "We're seeing debris everywhere," but no movement, no life. At 1 a.m., the first Coast Guard cutters reached the debris field. They moved cautiously, their floodlights revealing haunting images. A child's shoe, a torn passport, a half-burned seatbelt floating in the waves. Sailors leaned over the rails, pulling fragments from the water, fragments that once carried families, dreams, laughter. On board one of the rescue boats, silence fell. Even the most experienced officers had never seen anything like it. There were no bodies waving for help, no emergency beacons, only floating wreckage and the faint smell of aviation fuel drifting across the sea. It was like the ocean itself was holding its breath, one rescuer later said. By sunrise, the recovery mission had turned into a reconstruction effort. Dozens of boats, ships and divers were deployed to search the area. The FBI, NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, and Navy salvage units worked side by side. Helicopters buzzed overhead, while sonar equipment scanned the seafloor. Divers went down into the dark, murky water, searching for wreckage, black boxes, and the remains of the passengers. It was one of the most complex recovery operations in U.S. aviation history. The crash site spanned more than 40 square miles of ocean. Each piece of debris they lifted from the water told part of a terrible story, a story written in metal, smoke, and silence. On the shore, families gathered near Mauritius Coast Guard Station, waiting for news. Mothers clutched photographs, Fathers demanded answers, and children sat quietly, not fully understanding what had happened. When the news finally came that there were no survivors, cries echoed through the hall. Reporters crowded outside the base, cameras flashing, microphones raised. News networks interrupted regular programming. Breaking news: all 230 people aboard TWA Flight 800 are confirmed dead. By midday, the story had spread across the world. France mourned its returning students. America mourned its families. And in the middle of the Atlantic, rescue crews kept working hour after hour, pulling up what they could, a process that would continue for months. But with the debris came questions, and soon, suspicions. Eyewitnesses from Long Island began calling authorities, insisting they had seen a streak of light rising into the sky before the explosion. "Looked like a missile," one man told investigators. Something went up, and then the plane blew apart. Television anchors repeated the claim. Was it a terrorist attack? A U.S. Navy missile test gone wrong? Or something even darker, a cover-up? Theories spread faster than facts. In an age before social media, news channels became battlegrounds of speculation. Meanwhile, investigators had only fragments, thousands of pieces of metal, wiring, and glass pulled from the ocean floor. They began painstakingly reconstructing the aircraft, piece by piece inside a massive hangar in Calverton, Long Island. It was like assembling a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, except this puzzle held the key to 230 lost lives. Under bright white lights, technicians laid out the twisted skeleton of the 747. Each fragment was tagged, measured and fitted onto a huge metal frame. Slowly, the ghostly shape of the aircraft began to emerge, burned edges, punctured panels, and twisted beams. Experts traced burn marks and deformation patterns, looking for the origin of the blast. The FBI treated it as a criminal investigation. The NTSB treated it as a technical mystery. For months, both agencies worked in parallel, but with different theories. The FBI leaned toward a bomb or missile. The NTSB leaned toward a mechanical failure. In the media, pressure grew. Every headline screamed for answers. Who brought down Flight 800? Terror or tragedy? Was it a missile? Families demanded truth, not speculation. By the end of the first month, more than 95% of the aircraft had been recovered from the ocean. Among the debris were the black boxes, the flight data recorder, and cockpit voice recorder. But when analysts played back the final minutes, there were no alarms, no words of panic, no sign of distress, only the calm hum of flight and then silence. No one had time to react. Whatever happened had been instant. Investigators stared at the evidence, wiring bundles, fuel lines, the remains of the center fuel tank, and one by one, the missile theories began to fade. The physical clues told a quieter, more tragic story: an electrical short circuit, a spark, and the explosion of fuel vapors in the center tank. But in July 1996, as the ocean gave up its secrets piece by piece, no one yet knew for certain. To the rescuers, it was a haunting mystery. To the families, it was unbearable loss. And to America, it was another reminder of how fragile the human journey through the sky could be. The Atlantic Ocean remained calm again, but beneath its surface lay the pieces of a story, a puzzle of fire, steel, and heartbreak. 4 years had passed since the night TWA Flight 800 fell from the sky near Long Island. People across America were still asking the same question: what really happened? Many believed it was a missile. Some said it was a bomb. Others thought terrorists were behind it. But after one of the biggest investigations in aviation history, the truth finally came out. In the summer of 2000, the National Transportation Safety Board called a press conference in Washington, D.C. The hall was full of reporters, cameras, and families who had waited years for answers. On the stage stood Jim Hall, the NTSB chairman. Behind him was a large image of the rebuilt airplane, the same Boeing 747 that had exploded over the Atlantic. He spoke slowly and clearly. After 4 years of investigation, the cause of the crash was an explosion inside the center fuel tank. It was most likely caused by a short circuit, a small electrical spark. The room fell silent. There was no missile, no bomb, no terrorist attack. Just one small electrical fault, and 230 lives were lost. Investigators explained what had really happened. The center fuel tank located under the cabin floor was almost empty that day. It was filled mostly with fuel vapors, and those vapors were extremely flammable. Inside the wiring system, one old wire short-circuited and sent a tiny spark into the tank. That spark ignited the vapors, and the explosion tore through the plane. It happened so fast that the pilots never had a chance to call for help. The plane broke apart in mid-air before anyone could react. At first, many people refused to believe this explanation. How could such a small wire destroy such a large aircraft? But the evidence was undeniable. More than 400 investigators worked for 4 years, checking millions of wires and more than 1 million pieces of wreckage pulled from the ocean. Every theory about missiles or bombs was tested and ruled out. This was not a crime. It was a technical failure, a tiny spark that led to a huge tragedy. In a large hangar in Calverton, New York, investigators rebuilt the airplane piece by piece from what they found in the sea. It looked like a giant metal puzzle. Every hole, every burn mark, every wire told a story. By putting it all together, they found exactly where the explosion had started. Inside the center fuel tank, right below the passengers' feet. The wires that ran near the tank had rubbed together for years. One of them had finally sparked. The more they studied, the clearer it became. This wasn't an act of hate or war, but an accident waiting to happen. For the families of the 230 people who died, the truth was painful to hear. It wasn't the answer they had hoped for, but at least now they knew what had happened. On the coast of Long Island, near where the plane fell, a memorial was built. It faces the sea, the same sea that took their loved ones. All 230 names are written on its stone walls. Every year, on July 17th, families gather there to remember. They bring flowers, light candles, and look out at the waves. Children who were too young then now stand grown, remembering parents they never got to know. Pilots, flight attendants, and locals come to pay their respects. The only sound is the wind and the water. The crash of TWA Flight 800 changed air safety forever. New rules were made to prevent another tragedy. Fuel tanks were redesigned so vapors could not ignite. Airlines were ordered to replace old wires. Boeing and other airplane makers improved their systems to make sure one small spark could never again bring down a jet. Because of these changes, every flight today is a little bit safer. This tragedy taught the world that even a small mistake can have enormous consequences. Today, the TWA Flight 800 Memorial still stands on Long Island. Visitors see the curved walls with the names of every passenger. Students, families, crew members, children. They never reached Paris, but their memory lives on. Every July, when the sun sets over the ocean, the families light candles and watch their reflections on the water. The light glows softly, peaceful and still, a sign of remembrance and love. When the investigation finally ended, Jim Hall said something simple yet powerful. A single spark took 230 lives. Let that remind us. In aviation, there are no small mistakes. Those words became a reminder to every pilot, engineer, and traveler that safety depends on the smallest details. The story of TWA Flight 800 is not only a tragedy, it is a lesson. Sometimes disaster doesn't come from war or hate. Sometimes it comes from something so small you can hardly see it. A tiny wire, a single spark, and it changes everything. And for the families who still stand by the sea, looking toward the sky where their loved ones disappeared, that truth will never fade. They remind the world that every journey matters, every life matters, and that we must never forget what happened that night.